You know, when we watch a marathon, there is this fundamental psychological expectation of fairness built right into the viewing experience.
Right, like a level playing field.
Exactly. The starting gun goes off, and everyone is running the exact same 26.2 miles.
I mean, sure, some runners might have access to better coaching or, those expensive carbon-plated shoes.
Yeah, or just superior genetic potential for endurance. But the physical track is the physical track.
Yeah.
The laws of physics, distance, and time apply equally to the entire field of competitors. It provides this comforting baseline of objective reality.
It creates a closed system where the outcome feels intrinsically justified. The person who crosses the finish line first is understood to have exerted the most effective combination of preparation and effort within the strict parameters of that closed system.
But imagine you tune into a marathon, and as the camera pans across the course, you realize that the architecture of the race itself is just, well, it's fractured.
Oh, wow. Okay, paint that picture for me.
So you see a handful of runners starting just 2 feet from the finish line. They're sipping water, just waiting to step across the tape.
Right.
Meanwhile, the vast majority of the field is starting 100 miles back, and they've been strapped with lead boots.
That's quite the visual.
And yet, the announcers on the broadcast are completely ignoring this disparity. I mean, they are calling the race with immense enthusiasm.
Okay, the totally normal race.
Exactly. They're praising the sheer athletic merit of the people who just stepped across the finish line from 2 feet away. And then they're subtly criticizing the form and work ethic of the people struggling 100 miles behind them.
Wow, yeah.
Suddenly, the way we perceive the race, the way we understand the concept of a winner or a loser, it's entirely broken.
Because what you are witnessing there is a systemic crisis in perception.
Yeah.
The overt narrative you're being fed, this story of a pure merit-based competition, is in direct contradiction with the underlying structural reality of the track. You're looking at a rigged architecture, but society is demanding you interpret it as a reflection of individual virtue.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today's deep dive explores The Disinherited Majority, Capital Questions Piketty and Beyond by Charles Derber.
It's such an important text.
It really is, and I want to set the parameters for you right out of the gate. This is not a standard book review. We aren't here to just summarize chapters.
Sure. Definitely not.
This is a systems-level analysis of wealth concentration, democratic institutions, and modern capitalism.
And Derber's work is vital here because it functions as kind of a sociological translation of Thomas Piketty's massive economic data sets.
Right, because Piketty's book was just incredibly dense.
Oh, it was a brick. I mean, Piketty gathered centuries of tax records and wealth data to map the mathematical trajectory of global capital.
Mm-hmm.
And Derber takes those cold, hard numbers and asks the critical follow-up questions like, what does this math do to our social fabric?
Yeah, how does it rewrite our political institutions?
Exactly. And most importantly, how does it alter the way we perceive our own value within the economy?
So we're going to examine the primary systems involved here: capitalist market systems, democratic political institutions, and the machinery of education and social mobility.
Lots of big systems to tackle today.
For sure. And the central guiding question we are unpacking today is this: how can a society celebrate meritocracy while increasingly allowing inherited wealth to determine who holds economic and political power?
That is the core paradox right there.
Because if we treat inequality merely as a problem of unequal incomes, focusing solely on the gap between a worker's hourly wage and a CEO's salary, we completely overlook the deeper structural forces.
We miss the invisible, self-reinforcing architecture that allows wealth, influence, and opportunity to accumulate and lock into place across generations.
And I think it's also really important to frame this properly before we dive into the mechanics.
Definitely.
When we discuss extreme wealth concentration, corporate power, or class divisions, it is incredibly easy to default to partisan political frameworks.
Oh, absolutely. People retreat to their corners really fast.
Right. But looking through the lens of Derber and Piketty, our goal is to maintain strict analytical neutrality. We are examining system-level claims.
We aren't looking at bad actors, malicious individuals, or specific political platforms. A mathematical feedback loop doesn't have a political affiliation.
Exactly. We are here to impartially report on the architecture of the system and the incentive structures it creates, not to endorse a specific political remedy or take a side.
So to understand how wealth accumulates across generations, we first have to look at the foundational mathematical engine driving modern capitalism.
Right, the math beneath it all.
And to do that, we have to look back at the story economics told itself for, well, the better part of a century.
Which was a pretty optimistic story, wasn't it?
Very optimistic. For a long time, the conventional wisdom in the mid-20th century was anchored by something called the Kuznets curve.
The Kuznets curve. Okay, let's unpack that.
The basic narrative was that capitalism, as it matures, naturally creates a growth tide that lifts all boats.
Simon Kuznets was a brilliant, highly influential American economist working in the mid-20th century, right?
He was. And he was one of the first economists to really dig into historical tax data, specifically looking at the United States from roughly 1913 to 1948.
Okay, so a very specific window of time.
Exactly. And when Kuznets plotted out income inequality over that specific period, he saw a distinct bell curve, an inverted U-shape.
Meaning it went up and then came back down?
Exactly. He saw that in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, inequality spiked dramatically as the robber barons amassed fortunes.
Right, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers.
But then as the economy matured into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, that inequality began to steadily decline. The wealth was spreading out. The middle class was expanding.
And from that one specific set of data, a massive macroeconomic theory was born.
It became the absolute bedrock of modern mainstream economic thought.
Because it told a very comforting story.
It did. The Kuznets curve suggested that while capitalism is messy in its infancy, it inherently possesses a self-correcting mechanism.
Like it just fixes itself over time.
Right. The idea was if you just leave the system alone, if you let the markets mature, technological progress and the spread of education will naturally distribute wealth more evenly.
Which was a profoundly comforting theory, especially during the Cold War.
Oh, massively, because it offered a mathematical counter-narrative to Marxist critiques.
Mm-hmm.
It essentially said, don't worry about the inequality, it's just a temporary growing pain of a system that will eventually enrich everyone.
But then Thomas Piketty entered the chat with capital in the 21st century.
And completely disrupted that narrative.
Yeah, because Piketty didn't just look at 30 or 40 years of American tax data. He compiled a truly unprecedented historical data set spanning over 300 years.
He looked at tax records, state records, and national incomes across 20 different countries. It was a monumental effort.
And when you zoom out from Kuznets' tiny 35-year window and look at the trajectory of capital over 3 centuries, the self-correcting narrative completely collapses, doesn't it?
It totally falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Piketty's data reveals something startling, which Derber focuses heavily on.
Which is?
That the mid-20th century wasn't the natural, mature endpoint of capitalism at all. It was a bizarre, extreme historical anomaly.
Wow. Okay, so that golden era wasn't supposed to happen.
The period of greater economic equality that Kuznets observed, the era that gave birth to the robust American middle class, was not caused by the natural magic of free markets.
It was caused by what Piketty calls catastrophic shocks to capital.
Yes.
I want to dig into those shocks because they fundamentally change how we view the golden age of the American middle class.
Right. It totally flips the script.
When we talk about the destruction of wealth in the first half of the 20th century, we aren't just talking about a mild recession. We are talking about World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II happening in rapid succession.
Exactly. Think about the physical and financial devastation of that period. You had global wars that literally leveled the factories, estates, and infrastructure of the European elite.
Right, the physical capital was just bombed out of existence.
And then you had the hyperinflation of the 1920s in places like Germany, which absolutely wiped out the value of government bonds.
Which was the preferred safe asset of the wealthy rentier class at the time?
Precisely. Then you had the collapse of foreign colonial empires, which vaporized massive overseas investments.
Just massive amounts of wealth disappearing overnight.
And crucially, to fund these massive global wars and the subsequent recoveries, governments implemented unprecedented, aggressively high progressive taxation.
Yeah, top marginal tax rates in the U.S. and U.K. soared above 80 or 90% during that time.
So this accumulation of dynastic wealth that had been building since the 1700s was suddenly subjected to a 30-year wood chipper.
A 30-year wood chipper, that's a great way to put it.
The capital at the top was destroyed, inflated away, or taxed into oblivion.
And simultaneously, following World War II, you had a unique period of rapid economic and demographic growth, the baby boom, the rebuilding of Europe, massive infrastructure projects.
Yes, the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of post-war growth. During this specific, isolated window, labor unions had immense bargaining power, Minimum wages were high relative to inflation, and the wealth gap dramatically narrowed.
But Piketty's central thesis is that economists made a fatal observational error.
They did. Derber points out that they looked out the window during a hurricane, saw a flying cow, and wrote down, "Cows naturally fly."
That's amazing.
They mistook a temporary, disaster-driven equalization process for a permanent structural law of nature.
Which means our entire modern economic optimism, this deep-seated belief that things will just naturally balance out if the market keeps growing, it's built in a statistical fluke caused by the most violent era in human history.
It really is. It's a sobering realization.
So if the Kuznets curve isn't the fundamental law of capitalism, what is?
This is where we arrive at the core of Piketty's framework, which Derber analyzes extensively. It is the fundamental equation of inequality.
Right, R greater than G.
Exactly. Written simply as RG. The rate of return on capital, which is R, is historically almost always greater than the rate of economic growth, which is G.
Okay, let's unpack this because we want to make sure we are completely grounded in the mechanics of this. This little equation is the invisible architecture we mentioned earlier.
It's the engine driving everything Derber is warning us about.
So first, capital. Capital or wealth isn't just money sitting in a checking account.
No, it's everything you own that can yield a return without you physically having to work for it.
Like real estate generating rent.
Or corporate stocks generating dividends, bonds yielding interest, intellectual property generating royalties. All of that is capital.
And historically, if you average it out over centuries, the rate of return on that capital, the HAR, has consistently hovered around 4.5 to 5% per year.
It doesn't matter if it was agricultural land in the 18th century, industrial machinery in the 19th century, or diversified financial portfolios in the 21st century. Capital consistently yields about 5%.
Now contrast that with G, the economic growth rate. This is the growth of the overall national income, the expansion of the actual productive economy.
Right, which is driven mostly by population growth and technological innovation.
And historically, over the long run, G has hovered at a crawl around 1 to 2%.
And here is the key for you listening. Wage growth for the vast majority of the population is intrinsically tied to G.
So you have a permanent mathematical divergence. 5% is greater than 1.5%. R is greater than G.
And the terrifying reality of this equation is that it is not a glitch in the matrix.
What do you mean?
Well, this extreme divergence isn't caused by a flawed market or cronyism or corruption, though those things certainly exacerbate it.
Sure.
Derber and Piketty argue that the more perfect, efficient, and transparent the capital market is, the more likely R is to remain greater than G.
Wow. So inequality is not an aberration. It is a feature functioning exactly as mathematically designed.
Exactly. It's baked into the system.
I was trying to visualize the sheer force of this disparity because, percentages can feel very abstract.
Yeah, definitely. How do you picture it?
Think of the economy as a massive airport with two separate movement systems. Most of us are walking on the floor.
Okay, I can see that.
That floor represents wage growth, G. We are putting in 40, 50 hours a week, sweating, trying to walk faster, maybe jogging to get a promotion or a raise.
And you are moving forward at 1 or 2% a year.
Right. But right next to us is a high-speed moving walkway. That's the capital escalator representing R.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
It's moving effortlessly at 5%. If you own enough capital, you don't even have to walk. You just stand on the belt, and the machine does the work.
You are soaring past the people sweating on the floor.
And here's the brutal part. The people walking on the floor are constrained by biology. You can only work so many hours in a day. You can only run so fast.
But the moving walkway has no biological limits. It compounds infinitely, day and night.
That analogy really captures the precise mechanism of divergence, I think.
It does. And we have to factor in the compounding nature of wealth at the very top, which Derber focuses on.
Right, because it accelerates.
Yes. If you have a massive fortune, you only need to consume a tiny fraction of your capital returns to live an incredibly lavish lifestyle.
So if your investments yield 5% and you only spend 1% on your yachts, mansions, and private jets,
you are reinvesting the remaining 4%. Your fortune is growing at 4% a year, while the overall economy and the wages of everyone in it is only growing at 1.5%.
So mathematically, the gap between those who own capital and those who rely on their labor must widen relentlessly over time.
It is mathematically guaranteed. And the larger the fortune, the more efficient the compounding becomes.
Right, because if you have $10 billion, you aren't managing it yourself.
You hire the absolute best money managers, private equity firms, and tax architects on the planet. You gain access to exclusive investment vehicles that the general public cannot touch.
So your personal wire might be 7 or 8%, completely tax optimized.
Meanwhile, a middle-class worker with a meager savings account is earning less than 1% interest, which is entirely eaten by inflation.
This is why you, as the listener, need to fundamentally reevaluate how you perceive your own economic trajectory.
It really changes the whole paradigm.
We are conditioned to believe that if we just work a little harder, get a better job, negotiate a slightly higher salary, we can ascend to the upper echelons of wealth.
But R greater than G reveals that working harder at a wage-paying job cannot, mathematically, close the gap with those who earn through capital.
The math simply does not allow human labor to outpace the compounding velocity of accumulated wealth.
It just doesn't. And if that mathematical engine continues to operate undisturbed over decades, which it has been doing since the 1980s, we have to ask what happens to the underlying social structure of a society.
Right. If the gap between the walking floor and the moving walkway becomes unbridgeable, society stops being a fluid class system.
It hardens into something much older and much more rigid.
Which brings us to Derber's profound sociological analysis of the data. Derber points out that because of R greater than G, we are rapidly transitioning back into patrimonial capitalism.
An inheritance society. We are witnessing the return of what Derber calls caste classes.
When we usually use the word caste, we are referring to immutable biological or cultural realities. We think of race, we think of gender.
Or historically rigid, religiously sanctioned systems like the ancient caste system in India or the aristocracy of feudal Europe.
Right. The defining feature of a caste is that you are born into a station, and regardless of your intellect, ambition, or moral character, you will die in that exact same station.
Whereas class, in the American narrative at least, is supposed to be fluid. You can be born into poverty, work hard, innovate, and die in the upper class.
But Derber argues that extreme multi-generational wealth concentration has transmuted economic position from a fluid class into a lifelong inherited caste.
The top 1%, and certainly the top 0.1%, are solidifying into a modern rentier class.
And a rentier is someone who extracts income purely from the ownership of assets, right?
Exactly. They live off the rents, the dividends, the interest, without needing to contribute productive labor to the economy.
And because their wealth is compounding faster than the economy grows, they are inevitably passing down multi-million or multi-billion-dollar fortunes to their descendants.
Meaning their children are literally born onto the moving walkway.
They never have to step foot on the walking floor.
Never. Their economic supremacy is secured at the moment of birth, entirely divorced from any merit or effort.
And the inverse of this is what Derber terms the disinherited majority.
Yes. The bottom 50%, and increasingly the middle class as well, are trapped in a permanently dispossessed economic station.
Because they own no meaningful capital.
Right. Their wages are stagnant relative to the cost of living, meaning they cannot save enough to acquire capital.
Therefore, they have no capital to pass down. Their children will inherit that exact same dispossessed station.
The rungs of the economic ladder are systematically removed.
Derber uses a brilliant literary framing to illustrate this reality. He pulls references from 19th century novelists like Honoré de Balzac and Jane Austen.
Oh, I love this part of the book.
Right. If you read those books, which are set in old Europe's Belle Epoque, a period of peak patrimonial capitalism, the characters all understand a very dark, fundamental truth about their economy.
There is that famous scene in Balzac's Le Père Goriot, where the cynical criminal Vautrin gives a speech to the ambitious young student Rastignac.
Yeah, Vautrin just lays out the brutal math of their society.
He tells Rastignac, you can study the law for 20 years, you could work yourself to the bone to become a top prosecutor or an elite merchant, and at the end of your life you might earn a very respectable salary. But it will be absolute crumbs compared to what you will acquire instantaneously if you simply marry a woman with a massive inheritance.
The characters in these novels knew that relying on labor and intellect was economically irrational if your goal was to accumulate true wealth.
The only logical strategy was inheritance or marriage.
And Derber's and Piketty's data suggests we are hurtling right back toward that Belle Epoque reality.
We really are. We like to think of our modern era as an age of boundless innovation, driven by tech geniuses and self-made disruptors.
But let's look at a specific comparison from the source material that shatters that illusion.
The Bill Gates and Lillian Bettencourt comparison.
Yes. Compare the wealth trajectory of Bill Gates with that of Lillian Bettencourt.
Between 1990 and 2010, Bill Gates was arguably the most productive, innovative entrepreneur on the planet.
He was actively working, revolutionizing personal computing, building a global monopoly, and contributing immense technological value to the global economy.
While Lillian Bettencourt, on the other hand, was the heiress to the L'Oreal Cosmetics fortune.
She never worked a day in her life to build that company. She simply inherited the capital.
And when you look closely at the numbers Derber cites on this, it is staggering.
During that exact same 20-year period, despite Gates's relentless labor and world-changing innovation, his wealth did not grow faster than Bettencourt's.
In fact, Bettencourt's inherited fortune grew from roughly $2 billion in 1990 to $25 billion in 2010.
The sheer mathematical force of the return on her massive initial capital completely outpaced the wealth generated by the most successful technological innovator of the era.
The inheritance engine is vastly more powerful than the innovation engine.
But this raises an important counter-argument that people often make.
Right, the tech boom argument.
Yeah. People point to the modern tech boom, the Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs, Jeff Bezoses, and argue, look, these guys didn't inherit their wealth, they are self-made billionaires. Doesn't that prove the system still rewards extreme innovation over inheritance?
But Piketty's framework actually addresses this transition perfectly. If you look closely at these massive tech fortunes, they don't disprove R greater than G. They eventually become consumed by it.
Okay, what's fascinating here is how that transition happens. Piketty notes that every massive fortune begins with some form of entrepreneurial shock or innovation. Right.
Yes. Henry Ford was a self-made entrepreneur. His great-grandchildren are pure rentiers. But even within a single lifetime, the transition occurs.
Right. Once a tech founder's net worth crosses a certain event horizon, say $30 or $40 billion, the nature of their wealth changes.
Exactly. The billions of dollars in growth they experience year over year eventually has far less to do with their daily labor as a CEO and everything to do with the fact that their massive portfolio of diversified capital is compounding at 5 to 8%.
The successful entrepreneur inevitably metamorphoses into a rentier of their own initial success.
And when they pass that unspendable mass of capital to their heirs, the patrimonial caste system is instantly reinforced.
What I found profoundly compelling in Derber's sociological analysis is how he explores the intersectionality of this new economic caste system.
It's a very unifying, if depressing, concept.
Right. The disinherited majority obviously includes marginalized groups, low-income people of color, and women who already face profound historical and biological caste barriers.
They have been historically excluded from capital accumulation through redlining, wage discrimination, and disenfranchisement.
But Derber points out that the sheer gravitational pull of R greater than G is expanding the borders of the disinherited caste.
It now solidly encompasses millions of working-class and middle-class white men.
These are individuals who historically benefited from cultural privilege, but who are now watching their manufacturing jobs vanish, their pensions dissolve, and their real wages stagnate.
Derber suggests this shared experience of absolute economic disinheritance could theoretically become a unifying political force.
You have highly diverse demographics, groups that have historically been pitted against each other in cultural wars, suddenly realizing that they are trapped on the exact same stagnant walking floor.
They're all permanently locked out of the capital escalator, regardless of their cultural background.
So if we are basically returning to a feudal society of lords and serfs, where the lords live off compounding inherited capital and the serfs struggle to survive on stagnant wages, why aren't people in the streets?
That is the million-dollar question.
How does the system keep the disinherited majority from rebelling?
Well, to sustain a rigid caste system in a modern, theoretically democratic era, you cannot rely purely on military force or the divine right of kings, as they did in the Middle Ages.
Right, that doesn't fly anymore.
The population must be deeply ideologically convinced that the system they are living in is perfectly fair and objective.
And the ideological shield that provides that essential conviction, the narrative that pacifies the disinherited, is the myth of meritocracy.
Meritocracy. It is the absolute bedrock of the American ethos.
It's the deeply internalized belief that if you are at the top of the economic hierarchy, it is exclusively because you are the smartest, most talented, hardest working person in the room. you earned your millions.
And conversely, the dark shadow of meritocracy is the belief that if you are struggling at the bottom, it is a direct reflection of your own inadequacy.
You didn't work hard enough, you didn't study the right subjects, you failed.
But we have to dissect the structural logical tension between meritocracy and the reality of inherited wealth, because they are entirely incompatible concepts.
They are fundamentally opposing forces.
Yes. If your wealth, your access to elite networks, and your position in society are largely determined by the capital you inherit, then your personal individual merit is statistically irrelevant.
The two concepts cannot coherently coexist in the same economic space. It's a glaring logical fallacy.
It really is. If someone inherits $50 million in diversified index funds, they could be the laziest, most incompetent, most intellectually bankrupt person on the planet.
Yet, because of R greater than G, they will yield $2 or $3 million a year in passive income.
They will wield infinitely more economic power and societal influence than a brilliant, dedicated trauma surgeon who works 80 hours a week saving lives, but only earns a labor-based wage.
Where is the merit in the passive compounding of a deceased parent's assets?
To defend against this obvious, gaping contradiction, the 1% relies heavily on an economic concept called marginal productivity theory.
Marginal productivity theory. Okay, what is that exactly?
It emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mostly as a way to mathematically justify the extreme wealth of the Gilded Age.
Convenient timing.
Very. The theory claims that in a perfectly competitive free market, every single factor of production, whether it's a machine, a plot of land, or a human worker, is paid exactly the value of what it contributes at the margin.
Therefore, if a CEO is making $40 million a year, which is 400 times what their average line worker makes, marginal productivity theory argues that the CEO is literally, mathematically contributing $40 million of unique, indispensable value to the firm.
The justification is essentially, yes, the inequality looks extreme, but the market is a perfectly objective calculating machine.
My $50 million compensation package isn't greed. It is a scientifically accurate measurement of my unparalleled genius and productivity.
Exactly. But Piketty's and Derber's analysis completely shreds this defense. Well, Piketty points out the practical absurdity of the theory when applied to modern corporate structures. How do you objectively measure the specific marginal productivity of one single executive in a massive, sprawling global corporation with 100,000 employees and deeply complex supply chains?
You can't. It is an empirical impossibility.
Instead of objective market forces, Piketty shows that these supermanagers effectively set their own salaries through corporate self-dealing.
They sit on each other's boards of directors.
They hire compensation consultants whose implicit job is to constantly ratchet up the median pay of executives.
They wield immense internal political power, and they decide their own worth.
Right. Executive compensation at the highest levels has far less to do with measurable economic productivity and far more to do with pure, unchecked bargaining power.
When I was looking at Derber's analysis of this, what struck me as truly fascinating is the contrast he draws between modern capitalism and medieval feudalism.
It fundamentally changes how you view the morality of wealth.
Because in the Middle Ages, feudal lords never claimed to have earned their vast estates through hard work. They believed they ruled by divine right. They had blue blood.
In fact, physical labor was considered vulgar and entirely beneath them.
But precisely because they recognized that their extreme privilege was an unearned divine gift, the system often embedded a concept of noblesse oblige.
A moral religious obligation to provide basic protection and alms for the peasantry.
It was an incredibly oppressive system, obviously, but it acknowledged its own unequal architecture. The lord didn't look at the starving serf and say, "You just lack the merit to be a lord."
The lord understood the serf was born a serf. But today's rentiers, these supermanagers and inheritors, operate with a completely different psychological framework.
Because they use the language of marginal productivity.
Right. They claim they earned their staggering wealth through sheer talent, grit, and merit. And by claiming their extreme wealth is purely meritocratic, they effectively bypass any moral obligation to the poor.
If the wealthy deserve every penny they have because they are intellectually superior, then it logically follows that the poor deserve their poverty because they are inferior.
The poor are reframed not as a vulnerable class requiring systemic support, but as takers or failures who simply lack the work ethic to succeed.
Meritocracy ceases to be an ideal. It becomes a weaponized ideology used to justify massive inequality and dismantle social safety nets.
There's a really poignant, undeniable example in the source material regarding this disconnect between market wages and true societal value.
The nursing home caretaker example.
Yes. Think about the intrinsic social value of caring for our elderly and vulnerable populations.
It is incredibly challenging work. It is physically grueling, emotionally exhausting, and absolutely vital to the functioning and moral fabric of a society.
If you measure it by actual human value, it is off the charts.
Yet, the so-called objective free market routinely prices that labor at or barely above minimum wage.
Which is the ultimate proof that market wages do not reflect true merit, societal contribution, or objective productivity. Wages reflect bargaining power.
They reflect historical disenfranchisement.
Caretaking work has historically been performed by women, and disproportionately by women of color. The market inherits those deep-seated social prejudices and devalues the labor accordingly.
The caretaker lacks the leverage to demand a higher wage, while the CEO sits on a board that rubber stamps their own multi-million-dollar stock options.
If you are listening to this right now, consider the profound psychological toll this ideology extracts from the average person.
If you are deeply conditioned to believe the system is a pure objective meritocracy, and yet you are struggling to pay rent despite working two exhausting jobs, how does your brain process that reality?
You don't look at the systemic architecture. You inherently blame yourself.
You internalize your lack of wealth as a profound personal failure. You look in the mirror and think, I must not be smart enough, I must not be working hard enough.
You view your economic struggles as a reflection of your soul, rather than recognizing it as a structural, mathematical certainty driven by the gravity of R greater than G.
The psychological damage is staggering. The disinherited majority is being crushed by a mathematical engine, but they are systematically gaslit into believing it is a reflection of their own character.
But wait, the immediate defense to all of this, the classic American rebuttal, is education.
Right. We have always been told that education is the ultimate tool for upward mobility. It is the great equalizer.
The narrative is, yes, the system might be tough, but if you put your head down, get good grades, and get a solid university degree, you can break out of your caste.
Education levels the playing field. That's the promise.
And structurally, in theory, it should be true. Piketty's data acknowledges that historically, the diffusion of knowledge and widespread access to education are the most powerful forces of convergence.
Meaning they are the primary mechanisms that push back against inequality and distribute wealth more evenly?
Yes, but the reality on the ground tells a very different story, doesn't it?
It does. Here's where the empirical hammer drops. Throughout the 20th century, the average level of education in the United States rose significantly.
Millions more people graduated from high school and millions more attended college.
If education was functioning purely as an equalizer, we should have seen the wealth gap narrow.
Instead, as the populace became vastly more educated, earned income inequality did not decrease. It exploded.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that failure. If more people are acquiring the supposed tool of mobility, why is the latter still breaking?
Because the nature of education itself has been co-opted by the patrimonial system. Access to elite education has become dictated almost entirely by the existing economic castes.
The Ivy Leagues? The top-tier medical and law schools?
Derber presents staggering data on the distribution of college degrees. Consider this. Between 1970 and 2010, the proportion of university degrees going to children from the bottom 50% of the income hierarchy barely budged.
It stagnated at around 10 to 20%.
Meanwhile, over that exact same four-decade period, for children born into the top 25% of the income bracket, degree attainment skyrocketed from roughly 40% to over 80%.
I want to make sure that lands for you listening. Over 40 years, university degrees became a prerequisite for basic middle-class survival, but all the growth in who actually got those degrees went to the children of the wealthy.
Parental income is now an almost perfect statistical predictor of university access.
It forces us to realize that higher education is increasingly no longer a meritocratic sorting mechanism. It is a financial auction won by the highest bidder.
Wealthy parents can afford to buy homes in the most lavishly funded public school districts. They can afford the private tutors, the exorbitant test prep courses,
and the astronomically rising tuition costs of the universities themselves.
Furthermore, they can leverage legacy admissions and donor networks. The system is structurally designed to launder inherited financial privilege into an academic credential.
Which means, when we look at a university degree from an elite institution today, It doesn't solely certify exceptional intelligence or superior work ethic.
Increasingly, it functions as a societal certification of the inherited financial privilege of the parents. It is a caste marker cleverly disguised as an academic achievement.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We have to factor in the debt trap.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's say a student from the bottom 50%, a member of the disinherited majority, does everything right. They study relentlessly, they overcome the systemic hurdles, and they get into a good university.
To afford it, they are forced to take on massive amounts of student debt. Upon graduation, they do not start at zero. They start deeply in the negative.
So their personal R is completely negative.
Exactly. While their wealthy peers are taking unpaid internships to build elite networks or immediately beginning to compound their inherited capital in the stock market.
The indebted graduate is funneling a massive percentage of their wages into paying high interest to financial institutions.
The debt handicap ensures that even if they secure a high-paying wage, they can never catch up to the compounding wealth of the rentier class.
But let's take this a step further and challenge the whole premise.
Okay.
Let's imagine a scenario where we fix the educational system entirely. We wave a magic wand tomorrow, and all university education becomes perfectly free, perfectly merit-based, and completely untethered from parental wealth or legacy status. Everyone gets a fair shot at the knowledge.
Even if we achieve that utopian vision of education, Derber points out a grim reality.
If the architecture of the economy itself is hollowing out, education can't save you.
Right. If the good-paying middle-class jobs are disappearing due to relentless corporate consolidation, global outsourcing, and rapid automation, no amount of free education guarantees upward mobility.
That is the ultimate structural trap.
If the fundamental mathematical engine of the economy is shifting rewards aggressively away from labor and toward capital, having a highly educated populace doesn't solve the problem.
If you have 10 million brilliant, highly educated graduates competing for a shrinking pool of 500,000 high-wage jobs, you haven't created a prosperous society.
You have simply created a highly educated, deeply frustrated, hyper-competitive, disinherited majority.
Education is a ladder, yes, but if the floor that ladder rests on is rapidly sinking into the ocean, climbing to the top rung doesn't prevent you from drowning.
If you are listening, this really forces a profound, uncomfortable reevaluation of your relationship with the American dream.
The social mobility that does still exist in our system is starting to look less like a virtuous reward for noble, productive, hard work.
And more like a desperate, sociopathic struggle for survival. Derber uses a very evocative pop culture reference to explain this.
He compares the modern pursuit of wealth to the culture portrayed in Martin Scorsese's film, The Wolf of Wall Street.
Right. Upward mobility today is often less about building a better mousetrap or contributing value to your community, and more about clawing your way into the 1% using financial leverage, regulatory arbitrage, and ruthless abstraction.
Which brings us to the ultimate macro-level consequence of this entire systemic feedback loop.
When economic power concentrates so aggressively at the absolute top, and when the traditional ladders of mobility like education are broken or co-opted, the wealth doesn't just sit statically in bank accounts.
It demands to protect itself.
And so the final system to be impacted, corrupted, and eventually overtaken by this concentration of capital is the political system itself.
We are looking at the inevitable collision between capitalism and democracy. There is a famous quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis that Derber uses to anchor this section, and it is chilling in its simplicity.
Brandeis said, "We must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both."
Piketty's historical data and Derber's sociological framework both point to this inescapable conclusion. There is a fundamental structural tension between the inherent inequality generated by a capitalist market and the inherent equality demanded by a functioning democracy.
Piketty argues that capitalism, if left to its own mathematical devices with R greater than G operating unchecked, automatically generates arbitrary, unsustainable inequalities.
These inequalities eventually grow so large that they radically undermine the egalitarian values that a democratic society requires to function.
Now, if you listen to neoclassical economists, they will often argue the exact opposite.
They promote the narrative that free markets and democracy are not just compatible, they are practically synonymous.
The argument usually goes like this. Free markets are inherently democratic because they are built entirely on the concept of voluntary exchange.
No one puts a gun to your head and forces you to buy a specific smartphone. You vote with your dollars. No one forces you to take a specific job. You enter into an employment contract voluntarily.
Therefore, the market is the ultimate expression of democratic freedom.
But Derber pushes back incredibly hard on that illusion. He argues that we must stop treating markets as if they are neutral, natural phenomena like gravity or the weather.
Markets are social constructions. They are built entirely out of human laws, regulations, and enforcement mechanisms.
And because they are human constructions, they are permeated by intense, often brutal power dynamics.
If a massive, consolidated multinational corporation moves into a small town, drives all local businesses into bankruptcy, and becomes the sole employer in the region, your voluntary choice to work for them for minimum wage or watch your family starve is not a democratic choice.
It is economic coercion masked as freedom.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we need to look at Derber's critical distinction between procedural democracy and substantive democracy.
Because when people hear democracy is failing, they immediately look at elections and say, well, I can still vote, so democracy is fine.
Yes, that is procedural democracy. It's the mechanics. You register, you go to a voting booth, you cast a ballot, the votes are collected and counted.
And by and large, in Western nations, the basic procedural mechanics remain intact.
But substantive democracy is entirely different. Substantive democracy asks, does your vote actually matter? Does the outcome of the election actually translate into public policy that reflects the will and the needs of the majority?
And Derber's terrifying argument is that substantive democracy is systematically destroyed by the sheer volume of inherited wealth.
When you have a rentier caste that controls more wealth than the bottom 90% of the population combined, that caste acts almost as an unelected executive committee for the nation.
They use dark money campaign finance, armies of corporate lobbyists, and the ever-present threat of capital flight to dictate policy behind closed doors.
They capture the regulatory agencies meant to oversee them. The procedural voting booths are left standing to give the population the illusion of participation.
But the actual levers of power are hollowed out by the reality of economic caste. Note again, this is Derber and Piketty's diagnosis of the systemic feedback loop between capital accumulation and political influence. We're not taking a partisan stance here.
Right. And the feedback loop between capital and political power becomes intensely self-sealing.
The wealthy use their accumulated capital to buy political influence. They then use that political influence to aggressively rewrite the rules of the game.
They slash top marginal tax rates, they defund the IRS, they dismantle labor unions, and they write opaque trade agreements.
Why? To ensure that R remains consistently greater than G.
These rewritten rules mathematically increase their wealth even faster, which in turn buys them even more political influence. It becomes an accelerating vortex that pulls all power upward.
And this massive concentration of wealth at the top doesn't just change our tax codes or our labor laws, it permeates downward.
It changes our culture, our psychology, and how the disinherited majority spends whatever little discretionary money they do have.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and it's where Derber brings in the brilliant 19th century sociologist Thorstein Veblen.
Veblen wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class, and he introduced a concept that defines modern consumer culture: conspicuous consumption.
I love looking at the historical context of this. During the American Gilded Age in the late 1800s, you had these incredibly ruthless robber barons, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers.
They amassed unimaginable fortunes through monopolies and extreme labor exploitation.
And what did they do with that money? They went to places like Newport, Rhode Island, and they built massive, absurd summer cottages that literally imitated the architecture of European palaces and castles.
Why do they do that? Veblen observed that because these American industrialists didn't have the literal divine blue blood or the historical titles of actual European nobility, they had to invent a completely new way to prove to society that they belonged to a superior caste.
They had to use exorbitant, highly visible, intentionally wasteful consumption to prove their superior essence.
They bought their nobility through excess.
Yeah.
The point wasn't utility, the point was the visible display of waste. A 70-room mansion for 3 people is profoundly wasteful, and that waste signals immense power.
But Veblen pointed out something even more insidious. This behavior doesn't stay contained at the top, it trickles down.
It infects the psychology of the 99%.
The disinherited majority, constantly seeing these displays of manufactured worth at the top of the hierarchy, begin to internalize the idea that human value is intrinsically tied to visible consumption.
So the middle and working classes begin to use whatever meager discretionary income they have, or worse, they take on high-interest consumer debt to compete against each other for what sociologists call cultural capital.
When I read that section, my mind immediately went to modern status symbols. We aren't building castles in Newport, but we are engaging in the exact same psychologic mechanism.
It's the designer handbag that costs 3 months' rent.
It's the luxury SUV that you can barely make the lease payments on. It's the hyper-expensive sneakers or the latest technological gadget.
Why does a disinherited worker who is struggling to build any actual capital spend their limited resources on depreciating luxury goods?
Because they are suffering from profound status anxiety. The system has stripped them of actual economic power, so they engage in compensatory consumption.
They buy the emblem of wealth to feel a fleeting sense of dignity and worth in a society that otherwise treats them as disposable labor.
And that is the ultimate tragic irony of the system.
Instead of recognizing the structural trap of R greater than G, instead of looking up and demanding the system be reformed, the working and middle classes are forced into a sociopathic, horizontal struggle against one another.
They exhaust their energy and resources trying to affirm their worth through consumerism, competing with their neighbors for fleeting cultural status. So, what does this all mean? We are buying things we don't actually need, often with money we don't actually have, to prove our worth to each other in a system that has mathematically excluded us from ever acquiring actual capital-generating wealth.
It is the ultimate distraction. While the 99% are fighting viciously over cultural crumbs and depreciating status symbols, the 1% are quietly, invisibly compounding their dynastic fortunes on the moving walkway of capital.
The patrimonial caste system isn't maintained by a standing army or a secret police.
It is maintained by distraction, status anxiety, and the powerful illusion of consumer choice.
Which brings us to the vital question we must ask at the end of every investigation. Looking at Piketty's historical data, looking at Derber's sociological analysis of the rentier class, the failure of education, and the corruption of democracy, what is the crisis in perception here?
The profound crisis in perception is that we fundamentally misperceive the very nature of inequality.
When we see a struggling worker or a decaying community or an expanding wealth gap, we are deeply conditioned to misperceive it as a problem of individual failure, a lack of education, a poor work ethic, or perhaps a temporary localized flaw in the market.
We are taught to look purely at the surface layer of income and opportunity. And in doing so, we completely miss the deeper hidden structural layer.
We miss the mathematical reality of R greater than G. We miss the inevitable rise of patrimonial capitalism.
The crisis is that we earnestly believe we are living in a meritocracy, a fair marathon, where everyone has a chance to win if they just train hard enough, when the centuries of systems data suggest we are rapidly transitioning back into a rigid, inherited caste society.
Surface-level explanations fail because they completely ignore how wealth naturally self-reinforces, how it relentlessly concentrates political power, and how it rewrites the rules of democracy to protect itself. We think we are running a marathon of merit, but we are actually on a track designed to ensure that those who inherit the finish line never have to break a sweat.
It's a sobering reality.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you navigate the economy this week. If our entire sense of self-worth in this society is deeply tied to the concept of earning our keep through hard work and productivity, what happens to our collective mental health when we truly realize the economy is structurally designed to reward inherited capital over human effort? If the track is rigged by mathematical design, how do we find authentic meaning in the run?
That's the real question.
Crisis in perception is not about telling people what to think. It is about making the systems shaping perception more visible. Because when structural forces remain hidden, meaningful change becomes far more difficult to imagine.
Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same: to think critically, follow the evidence, and remain open to changing your mind when the facts lead somewhere unexpected.
Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and learn to spot the crisis in perception.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.